We'll call the meeting of the Committee on Infrastructure to order Wednesday, November 8th, 2017 at 7:04 p.m. Would the clerk be so kind as to call the roll, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Alderman at Large Mark Cookson.
Present.
Alderman David Schoeneman.
Here.
Alderman Tom Lopez.
Here.
Alderman Sean McGinnis, I am here, and Alderman Richard A. Dowd is not
Absent.
currently present.
We had received an email communication earlier from our legislative assistant indicating that Alderman Dowd was going to be at a gala this evening and wasn't available to attend tonight's meeting. Also in attendance, we have Director of Economic Development, Tim Cummings, as well as Downtown Specialist, James Veo, and our City Clerk, Patricia Pietzu. I think that's all we have in attendance. Very good. All right. So at this point in time, we've got a large audience with us this evening. I'm going to ask for public comment. If you have a public comment, I'd ask for you one at a time to come forward. You may either speak at the microphone that Alderman Schoeneman is adjusting, or feel free to take the seat at the end of the horseshoe. Please state your name and address for the record, and then you may begin your comments.
My name is Peter Gevin, and I live at 16 Auburn Street in Nashua. First, I wanted to thank the committee for giving us a chance to provide our input. I'm a longtime resident of Auburn Street, and I'm opposed to specific parts of the proposed expansion of overnight parking there. I felt the expansion would cause many issues. I'm only going to be able to touch on some of them here tonight, as a lengthy discussion is not feasible given the time constraints of this forum, and I want to respect everyone's time. There was a public meeting on October 18th held by the Economic Development Department to solicit the input of the public regarding this proposed expansion on Auburn Street, as well as surrounding areas. This meeting was very well attended by at least 20 persons from the area. There was unanimous strong opposition to expansion of overnight parking in the northeast portion of Auburn Street, that portion from Amherst to Locust, or 1 Auburn to 20 Auburn. This area is a mixed-use district that is very different from the residence district where overnight parking has already been expanded. The opposition was from Auburn Street residents and businesses, including homeowners, business owners, lawyers, and administrators. Some felt the change would force them, residents and businesses, out of the area. There were safety and commerce concerns, including cars parked all day taking business and visitor spots, as well as danger from cars sliding down steep area hills and hitting cars parked on street in the winter, even when there's small amounts of snow, sleet, or ice. There was limited interest in parking on the southwest portion of the street, which is 20 to 30. However, some of those who originally supported parking in this area at that meeting now oppose it if anyone in the neighborhood is allowed to park there, I understand. So they were really only interested in people from Auburn Street being able to park on Auburn Street, and I'm sure you'll hear from them tonight. Furthermore, the public felt that any expansion of parking to that area of the southwest portion, 20 to 30, should be dealt with on a limited scale rather than adding 36 spaces spanning the entire length of the street. Public reached a consensus proposal at the meeting that overnight parking not be allowed on Auburn Street from Main to Locust, or I should say Amherst to Locust, with the possibility that may be considered from Auburn Street, on Auburn Street from Locust to Charles Street. The meeting attendees provided ideas and solutions to the problems of parking, including the development of unused lots near the corner of Charles and Franklin. A parking garage, as I understand, is being considered for underneath 34 Franklin, which is the new Lofts building, and renting unused spaces from private entities in the area, of which I understand there's plenty of unused spaces. So we're respectfully asking that the committee consider these alternatives instead of adding the proposed 36 spaces to Auburn. And we're respectfully asking that any legislation that may be introduced omit 1 to 20 Auburn Street. Again, that is the area of Auburn Street from Main, I should say Amherst Street again, from Amherst Street to Locust Street. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Nicholas Frasca, 2 Auburn Street, from the law firm of Frasca and Frasca, and I'd like to read my opposition into the record. We own the property at 2 Auburn Street, and we've owned it since 1983. I'd like to express my strong opposition to the proposed overnight parking that's currently under consideration. We operate our law office at 2 Auburn Street, and parking for our clients and those of other business on the street is a real issue. There's a 2-hour limit right now on parking on a portion of the street, but that restriction is rarely obeyed or enforced. Often people who work at 1 Main Street park on the street at 7:30 in the morning and don't leave until 5 p.m. If overnight parking is allowed, I'm concerned that those cars will remain on the street well into the business day and exacerbate an already difficult situation. Auburn Street should not be used as a parking facility for people who do not live in the area. Parking should be available for the businesses that operate there on a daily basis and for general parking on a time-limited basis. There are sufficient alternatives to overnight parking for the Auburn Street residents that should be utilized. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frasca. Good evening.
Good evening. Daniel Muller from Cronin Bisson Zelinsky, 722 Chestnut Street, Manchester. I'm here on behalf of 1 Main Street Professional Building LLC, the owner of 8 Auburn Street. My client also objects to the proposal as it currently stands for the expansion of the parking program. I'm not going to reiterate some of the points because his concerns reflect those of others that you've already heard. Specifically, he has staff and patrons who start to get there at 7:45 in the morning and is concerned that there won't be any spaces for those employees and patrons. We would note that the zoning in this particular area, part of it is D1, part of it is RC. The RC district, as a matter of policy, the notion is that you're going to have off-street parking there. So it really doesn't go into the nature of on-street parking, and there's supposed to be flexibility in the D1 district, which is where my client's property is located. They simply ask that you keep those existing public policies in mind as you consider this, and once again, would object particularly to the inclusion of the business area of Auburn Street within any expanded parking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any additional public comment this evening?
Yeah, Tom, last name Guevin, also from 16 Auburn Street. I'm also here to oppose the parking from 1 to 20. I have 3 specific reasons for that. They're outlined also here in this document. The hill and the gradient in the winter, we're really worried about. People have come into fences, people have hit on those yards. The second one is just the lack of demand. We don't know of anybody in this neighborhood from that 1 to 20 area. There's plenty of parking there. There's plenty of open spots there. There's parking behind the buildings, around the buildings. We don't know of any demand between 1 and 20. We've been seeking that out. We haven't heard anything about that. And the third one is, I just really want to speak in favor of the businesses in this area. This is not McDonald's and Walmart. These are family-owned businesses that have been in the area for a long time. They've been great for the community. They provide services, legal services, counseling services. We know, just in the news how important mental health is. And these are businesses that we've never had a problem with cars in front of the houses from these businesses. They clean up their trash. They're respectful. So I just want to also speak in favor of them and all the good work that they do for this community. That's all I had. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening, sir.
My name is Bert Kempton. I live at 30 Auburn Street. And I'm probably one of the ones that helped get this mess going because it was my wife and I was calling constantly to the city wanting to get overnight parking. We also went to the meeting and we saw what it would entail and how it would interfere with trash pickup. It would interfere, and the fact that anybody and everybody, well, they don't pick the trash up good now, anybody and everybody could park there, it wouldn't do us any good. We are the one he was talking about, from 30 to Locust. Our is 30, and then the last one on that side, and then Locust to Locust. And we're the ones with the very limited parking in all those areas. There's very limited parking for the people there. But if you do overnight parking and it's for anybody in the area that has a permit, well, it is not gonna do any good for the people that live there. So, after the meeting, we kinda had a 30 Auburn, there's, 2, 4, 6, 7 people living there now, at 30 and 28, and we sat down and had a little conference, and, they elected me to be the moderator or
Congratulations.
whatever. And they're all but one is opposed to it, so. Mainly, one was the trash pickup, that was 28 downstairs. She was, the one that was having the most problem was 28 upstairs. They had to sell a car because they don't have enough room to park. But they also now, because it's not gonna do them any good, they're opposed to it too, so. Basically, if it was just for people on the street, we'd say, yeah, please, we need it. But it's not, so it's not gonna do us any good. Thank you for hearing my voice, sir.
Thank you very much.
Oh, can I ask one other question?
Certainly, sir.
How do I get rid of the no parking signs in front of the house? They were put in because they said a fire truck couldn't get down through there. Well, today there was a construction equipment on one side, and there was these guys fixing the house 24 and 26. There was 4 or 5 vans, and one of your largest construction trucks just went right down through there with no problem.
We'll have your ward alderman address the concerns that you have.
Thank you, sir.
You're most welcome.
Hi.
Good evening.
Hi, good evening. I'm Karen Wolf, and I live at 23 Auburn Street. The parking for my property is generally in back of my house. It's on Highland Place, where the driveway to my house is and how I access the house most of the time. I'm not opposed to overnight parking on Auburn Street between Locust and Charles. I think that it should only be on one side of the street, preferably the north side of the street. I think that for me tonight, I'm just understanding the whole idea of the permit. If people get overnight parking permit, that means someone from another area in the city can come and park on my street, which I don't think is very likely, but I guess I think that that's okay. I'm not terribly opposed to it, but I also feel a little indifferent because if ever I do have an overnight guest that needs to park in front of my house, I simply call the Nashua Police Department and they're very accommodating. So it's not at all trouble on that end. A concern for mine that I wanted to voice, and I'm getting off of Auburn Street, but on Fairmount Street, which I use daily going to Amherst or turning off of Amherst, heading toward town to take a right on Fairmount. The little section that's close to Amherst Street, on the right, there's often a car parked like right there by the corner, which I really think is a concern and presents a problem for traffic turning off of Amherst Street because the traffic is going fast, and if you're heading toward Maine and you want to take a right on Fairmount, there's often a car parked there right on the corner. And then if there's someone coming toward Amherst Street and you're trying to turn in, it's kind of precarious. So I think that is something I'd like to see. And I also feel the same way about Franklin Street in front of Bonhoeffer's Cafe, where cars are parked there. It's very tight. If there are trucks passing and cars going toward Main Street and trucks coming off of Main Street, never mind if you're a bicyclist, you have no room at all. And I think there's a whole parking lot behind the church and behind Bonhoeffer's Cafe, so that area I think is a problem. So those are my concerns.
Wonderful.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
your
so
time.
much. I'm certain that Downtown Specialist Veo is making special note of those two specific concerns, especially as we see parking enforcement becoming under the auspices of Economic Development Office. So Thank you for those comments. Additional public comment this evening?
Good
evening, sir.
My name is Dan Schweitzer. I live at 29 Paxton Terrace. And my comment is not germane to the issue on Auburn Street. But I'm a tractor-trailer driver, and it's become very difficult to find a place just to pull over and get a cup of coffee. And whether or not people are aware of it or not, we all benefit from the enormous economies of scale that we get from tractor-trailer deliveries. And the new Dunkin' Donuts on Broad Street, even though I love Dunkin' Donuts and go there a lot myself, and it's a beautiful new store, it's completely commercial truck unfriendly. They might as well put up a sign saying we hate trucks, because even though that business is very dependent on trucks to keep their business going, you look at that parking lot and try and take my tractor trailer in there, good luck. And you just can't do it. So I don't know if this is within your purview or not, but if you could think on the big state roads like Broad Street and the other ones, if you could, a place like that where it'd be great for us to be able to stop running, get a cup of coffee and use the bathroom. If you could put up a sign that said, commercial vehicle only on the street there for with a 15-minute limit, something like that, that would be a huge help to us. I have to drive sometimes for 4 hours before I can take a bathroom break. It's just ridiculous, even though I'm doing multiple stops and stuff. And I love coffee. I'm a coffee addict. So that's my 2 cents. I appreciate everything you guys are doing here and coming in after your busy days.
Thank you. Appreciate the comments this evening. Any additional public comment? Good evening, sir.
Good evening. Sandra Silvani, represent 13 Charles Street and 29 Auburn Street. The overnight parking issue that I've been following and heard from tonight is obviously fairly sensitive at the north end of Auburn Street. The southern end, there was more concern. Bert seemed to have a different sense of it. I have a building on Charles Street that has 4 units, and I only have 4 parking spaces. So I'm limited in my ability to rent and attract certain tenants because I can only offer 1 parking spot. The overnight parking thing could be advantageous to me, financially advantageous to me, because it would allow me to offer to different type of tenants, which may attract more rent. So from a business standpoint, it's a better idea. There is currently 2-hour parking in front of my building. It doesn't get utilized. So I would suspect that if it needed to get utilized, it would only get utilized after midnight, if that's the only time that it became available. And I'm not exactly certain as to how far people are going to travel to park. If the permit issued for these 3 streets, Fairmount, Charles, and Auburn, are designated by a certain color or a letter code or whatever it is, then I would suggest that only those people who live on those 3 streets will be parking on those 3 streets. I'm not certain that this program is expanded to any resident in Nashua that can manage to come up with the funds to purchase the ticket. So, in other words, if we approve 40 spaces, we're only going to issue 40 permits. Am I correct in that assumption?
That will be discussed.
Okay.
I'm not certain to the specifics of it, but yes, there should be some limit, and we'll try to figure out what that is, and we'll probably have a little bit of a discussion about that this evening.
Great. And item 2 is, in the event this passes in some portion, what is the opportunity to revisit in the event that after 6 months or a year, it's created a lot of heartache? Would it be an annual review, or would it be something that'd have to come up by a referendum or something like that?
I think we could probably speak to that as well. I know that with, when we did the first implementation of overnight parking, we implemented it for 1 year with the expectation that we'd come back and revisit, and we'd try to determine what worked, what didn't work, and what areas we needed to improve upon. I'm not sure if we would suggest a year-long trial for this area. It might be an abbreviated time period that we could do within 3 to 6 months, but certainly all of those options are up for discussion.
Thank you very much.
You are most welcome. Thank you. Any additional public comment this evening? Please.
Hi,
Good evening.
my name is Maureen Noon, and I live at 13 Charles Street. Not so much really a specific comment, but a suggestion, because it looks like it possibly is going to go forward. And my suggestion would be that the people that live on Auburn Street have a permit for Auburn Street and no other street. Charles Street for Charles Street. I also have a suggestion that if the IDs are going to be numbered, that the streets markings should be numbered so that they could have their permit match their number, so that people would be comfortable seeing cars out in front of their house to the tenants that own them or the neighbors in which they know, so that it's not somebody from Franklin Street or somewhere else. I think that would be really advantageous. If you own the property and you want to offer those spots to your new tenants, then you know it's their car. If you have company, you can park your car in one of them, and then your company can park in your driveway. That would be the only way that I would be for something like that. Okay?
Thank you very
You're
much. All right. Any additional public comment? Okay. Seeing none, we will continue on with the regular agenda items. We'll move on to discussion. I would invite Director Cummings up at this point. Director Cummings, is there any additional, is Mr. Veo joining us, and is City Clerk Pietzu joining us for this part of the discussion? Yes. Wonderful. So please join us around the horseshoe, find a comfortable seat. Not that one. I'm kidding. All right. Oh, look at you. You came prepared.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
All right. Director Cummings, would you like to kick things off this evening?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development for the city. If I understand the agenda appropriately, we will be starting off the discussion relative to the overnight parking program, which we've been discussing for quite a while now. And I want to start my comments by saying we are very sensitive to the concerns and comments that we've heard over the last few weeks. Before you have a memo that outlines our most recent thoughts and sentiments on the issue. And there's some draft legislation that is behind the memo, which we can get into a little bit more specific detail. With those comments, Mr. Chairman, just a quick overview or update as to where we're at before I turn it over to Mr. Veo.
Certainly. Before you continue with that, I just want to, do you only have enough copies of these for the members of the committee? Do you have any extra copies?
I don't, but we
Okay.
could make copies. Does the committee have, does everyone?
I think everybody on the committee has one. I think that members of the public might be interested in seeing some of the communication, as well as maybe the draft legislation, so that they could follow along in the conversation.
Do you want us to go make a photocopy or two?
Just a few. That would be helpful.
Do you have your ID? Thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So as Mr. Veo goes to make photocopies, just very quickly, we left the conversation off relative to the overnight parking program, where we said that we would go out to the community and have meetings, discuss and take input from the community to help inform and promulgate the legislation. So with that being said, we further refined the draft legislation that is in front of you,
Good.
which essentially outlines the concerns as articulated. I would like to get into a little bit more detail relative to where you'd like parking, if you want parking at all on Auburn Street. We're very sensitive to the concerns relative to the Auburn Amherst Street area. And I would recommend, and I think it's appropriate for us to continue looking at parking on one side of the street from Auburn to Fairmont on the southern end. I also will take this opportunity to note that I think I would not be doing the city a service by not making this comment, though it may not be very popular. It may be wise at a certain point in their future for the city to actually undertake a study as to whether meters should go in on Auburn Street. It would actually address some of the issues and concerns that have come to light as we've studied this area. That's not necessarily a conversation or topic to be had this evening, but it is something that I would note that I would recommend that the city entertain at some point relative to trying to improve the turnover of Auburn Street relative to the on-street parking. With that being said, Mr. Chairman, happy to take any questions, or if you'd like to actually go into specific detail relative to the legislation that is before you. I guess one final comment as I think about it. I'd also recommend that we just at this time update the street inventory list essentially at this time. Legislation has not been finalized for your review. It's still in draft form that we've been working on internally relative to creating a visitor parking program, relative to increasing the fees, relative to where the management of the program should occur. We're still internally vetting out a lot of those differing issues, and I didn't feel it was appropriate for us to move forward with that legislation. We would be looking to move that forward in January if we were. So with that being said, I'd like to just quickly go through the language that's in front of you. If you want to take a recess for the packets to come, I'm not sure.
So I was attempting to pull up the legislation online. Has it been submitted through
No.
legal? It has not. So the number that's identified up here, ordinance 1746, very good. So I can't call it up because that's calling about requiring the disclosure of contributions and expenditures, and that has nothing to do with what you've presented to us this evening. So the ordinance itself is going to be renumbered. That's fine. So let me just look at this. So we're talking about overnight on-street parking program in designated downtown areas. You've eliminated the language that indicates Ash Street from Kinsley Street to Lake Street. That's not necessarily pertinent to this conversation. What you have added in here are Auburn, Belmont, Charles, Chestnut, Fairmont, and Franklin. Next to Auburn Street, you have a blank line. I'm assuming this is the part for input and discussion.
Correct.
And we will at some point this evening come up with a potential recommendation for how we would like to have Auburn Street addressed.
That's absolutely correct, Mr. Chairman. My recommendation on this would be is that we focus on the southern end from Fairmont to the next following intersection up before we get to the grade change.
Charles to Locust? Southern end.
Charles to Locust, I think, yeah.
That's right.
And again, that should just be on one side, and it should be on the non-resident side.
On the north side
That's right.
of Auburn. It's the southern end of the street on the northern side of the road between Charles and Locust. The reason we don't want it on the southern side of the road is because we will have vehicles careening into them during the winter months, based on some of the earlier testimony. All right. So, in general, and I want to make this as participatory as possible, is there anybody in the audience, and I know this is not typical, but is there anybody in the audience who has an objection to the language as it was just read? That it is the southern end of Auburn Street, so that would be between Charles and Locust, and it would be parking on the northern side. If you have an objection to that language, please raise your hand.
Well, what numbers would be the northern side on Auburn?
It would be 29.
We're here, right? 29.
Here, I'll just. 29, 26, 23, and 2. Okay, no objections at all. Wonderful. That's how we do it. All right,
Sometimes.
well, it worked this evening.
Yeah, I'll take it.
All right, so that's Auburn Street. Are there any other aspects of Auburn Street that we need to be addressed, that we need to be concerned about? We've said the southern end, we've said between Locust and Charles and Locust. And so what are we going to do about the northern end of Auburn? Is it as is? We don't do anything to that property or to those stalls, and but we enforce the hours so that the businesses that are on the northern end of Auburn actually get the turnover that they need. So when their employees and potential clients come, they have a spot on street to park.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I heard one other comment, and I'm not sure if this is feasible, so I would ask anybody who's able to address this. The idea of, where's my agenda? There it is. The idea of permit by street. All right, so who wants to take that one?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I'd ask the Madam Clerk to respond to this, because I think this clarification is necessary.
Wonderful. City Clerk Piazza?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as far as currently, the way it is that residents are allowed to purchase a pass to allow them to park within that program. Because there are so many individuals within some of the apartment buildings that may need it, it's very difficult to limit it to that one street. Also, in looking at the purchasing of the passes, it's also the cost of the pass and everything that would be prohibited for the cost and everything. If we only have so many passes for this, usually there's a minimum amount that you have to purchase. We haven't looked at any of this right now because everything is totally up in the air. But some of it's logistics.
Okay. So one of the examples that we heard this evening, and I believe you, at, was it 29, that there are 7 or 8 tenants that are in that property? No.
There's 4 at 29, there's 4 at 13.
Okay, all right. Maybe it was another one that I'm recalling. I thought that there were 7 per se, but, we can use the 4. Let's say that on Auburn Street between Charles and Locust, and I don't know how many stalls would be installed in that area. Maybe there are only 4 stalls that are, let's say there are only 3 stalls that are there. But we'd certainly like to be able to provide the ability for that additional tenant to be able to park in the general vicinity.
Correct.
So if we're only able to get 3 in on Auburn, we wouldn't want to restrict them from parking on Charles or
Street.
whatever the case is.
That is correct.
So I think it comes, we have to be concerned about the inventory that's available. So can you address, do we have an estimated number of stalls between Charles and Locust? And do we have an estimated demand for between Charles and Locust of people who would take advantage of that opportunity? Thank you.
It was 30 and 28 was the 7.
Thank you. That's what I was thinking of.
Asking for the overnight parking the most, because there's only
Pardon me.
4 spots and there's 7 people.
Pardon me, sir. So, no, what I was going to say was everything that you're saying is not able to be picked up by the microphone. So a gentleman from the audience was indicating that I was referring to 30, 28, and 30 Auburn Street, which had 7 tenants and 4 spaces. Thank you. All right. Director Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're still waiting from DPW to give us an official number.
Okay.
Because that's who we have to turn to. We anticipate that we're not looking at very many parking spaces. So we don't have that specific number for that street, but we do know an approximate for the entire program that we've been talking about, which I believe is around 200-ish. I just want to make sure I'm not incorrect on
For the
that.
expansion,
Yeah, for the entire expansion inventory,
it would be less than 200.
less than 200. In terms of,
Less than 200 in this Franklin, Auburn, in this particular area?
in-
Plus the
Okay,
three
all right.
streets.
With
So-
the tree
so-
streets.
So
Way
let's not
less than
talk
that
about them. I'm talking Auburn, Fairmont, Franklin,
I don't know.
Charles.
I don't think we broke it out that way, so I would have to get back to you in terms
Okay.
of the specific neighborhood inventory number.
All right.
And again, we don't have Auburn Street yet because we were waiting for guidance on that. I think we're relatively comfortable with.
I can give you an estimate, sorry to interrupt. An estimate from a memo I put together in September based on linear footage. So Franklin Street, 450-foot length, which is the part that fronts on the Loft 34 building, 15 spaces. Charles Street for the distance between Fairmount and Auburn, 250 feet, 8 spaces. And then Auburn now is significantly different. That was just that 1,000-foot length, 36
Yeah, but it was
spaces.
36 at that particular time. It's now something less than that. So we went through, we've gone through a mathematical exercise, is basically what we've done, is we've said, we've got this much linear footage, and we can put this many stalls in that footage. But where is, help me close the gap between doing the mathematical exercise and understanding what the demand is in that particular area. Because we could be saturating this area with more parking stalls than are needed or necessary in it. So how do you balance the difference between the mathematical exercise and the demand that we could potentially have?
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Please.
we're basically trying to use the best data and information that we have available to us by collecting both quantitative and qualitative, information, and then ultimately trying to input it into some sort of planning scenario so that we can accommodate the growth as we anticipate the neighborhood changing, and trying to be reasonable about it so that capacity is available and that we don't have to revisit these conversations
On a regular
on
basis?
a regular basis. Thank you. So that's part of the reasons why we focused on these select neighborhoods to start with, because we know that these are the neighborhoods or these are the areas that overall within the neighborhood context, demand is significant, demand will be significant, and this type of planning exercise should be undertaken. I can't tell you, like I can relative to the real estate market, vacancy, what we're seeing for demand and absorption. I can't predict an absorption rate at this point in time.
You would never create enough stalls to satisfy 100% of the demand. That's
Yeah, no,
not something that you would do.
no.
So what percentage of the demand would you, 75, 80%?
75, I was just going to say, yeah, 80, 75, between 60 and 80.
Does that mean I could be an economic development director somewhere?
I think as a good rule of thumb, that's a good occupancy guideline.
So 75%. So would it be reasonable to say that as we've had this conversation this evening, some numbers have popped out? So at, again, it was 30? 30 Auburn has 7. You've got that written down somewhere, right?
7 demand for 7 spaces?
Well, right, he's got 7.
Approximately, right.
7 tenants, and then over at 13 and 23, 27?
29 and 13.
Thank you. 13 Charles and 29 Auburn, you've got 4 in each.
Yep.
Okay, so Is it a worthwhile exercise? I don't know. I'm looking for guidance on this. Is it a worthwhile exercise to understand what the demand is in the area, where they have parking, where they don't have parking? Who needs it? Somebody had to sell their car because they didn't have, they couldn't park there. So I'm just looking for some guidance here because I want to help these folks. I want to give them what they need. I want to help you. I want to, button this up before the end of the year and make sure that we're addressing your needs as well as the constituents' needs.
So, I'm sorry, I saw Alderman Schulman's hand up. I don't mean to cut him off, but I just wanted to quickly say, I don't know if we'll ever be able to give you the very specific concrete data that you're necessarily looking for. But what I can represent to you tonight is, again, this neighborhood is changing, and planning for that change, I think, would be good, particularly to a point that was made earlier, to be able to attract the tenant that would be necessary. I think is a valid one, and the zoning in this area is relatively flexible. So sometimes, and depending on where you are, you don't necessarily need to provide that off-site parking, and
Right.
so being able to do that and have more supply than less is a good thing in this circumstance. Erring on the side of caution in terms of providing more than trying to provide just under would not be the recommended approach on this.
Okay. Alderman Shoneman.
I was just going to concur with that. This is a dense area, and inasmuch as, over time, we're going to take a look at it again, knowing that we're not going to use the east end of Auburn Street, just that south end and the north side, and the streets, Charles and Fairmont, that we talked about. Get as many in there in those streets as we can, and then we'll see what happens. That's what we've done up on French Hill,
Right.
and we have a lot more spaces there than actually are utilized, but that's okay because it provides some flexibility. So I like the idea of putting as many as we can in there. We'll see what Public Works has to say.
Okay.
And then it sounds like there's no objection to that section of Auburn and maybe to none of the other streets as well.
Very good. Any additional questions or comments from the committee members? And then City Clerk Pietsu, number of, so we'll have a number X amount of stalls. And then what would you do with regard to permits and purchasing permits for sale? How would you determine what that number would be? Would you do X amount of stalls, or would you do some number less than the amount of stalls that would ultimately be suggested?
I guess it all depends what this committee comes back with the recommendation, because currently they can purchase up to 400 passes within the program. So if you're adding this into the overnight parking program, what are you going to increase that to? Because we're also, of course, looking at increasing the other streets as well. So you would have to look at how many spots that you have available within, or stalls you have available within the program, and then from there, allocate the number of spaces that are going to be available.
All right. So we're not choosing a different color for this section of, we're using one color for the entire overnight parking program. And somebody from the tree streets wouldn't necessarily park on Auburn Street, but would somebody from, across the street on, is Nashville part of the program? Or Orange Street? I know, so we've got parking on Orange Street, right? We don't have parking on Orange Street yet?
All the pink ones were proposed to be reviewed. The blue highlights are the ones which have existing program. It's kind of hard to see, but Dow Street there is one that has the program.
All right, great. Dow Street. Is it possible that somebody from Dow Street, that's probably the closest street that's available, would park potentially on Auburn Street? Okay. That's where you would see some of the overlap. Alderman Shoneman.
Thanks. Again, I don't think that's highly likely. It is a possibility because we only have one color and it's going to be for the entire city. Even though we call this a permanent program, it's still kind of evolving.
Correct.
So until we know what each area is going to be, then, we'll have one color. The likelihood of someone from Dow parking all the way down there is probably unlikely. We had a scenario a moment ago, we laid out, someone from Auburn could park on Charles, but it's not going to be that kind of distance. And what we found really with French Hill is that we have a lot more spaces than permits that have been issued, right? So there's a small number of permits issued. I think we're okay with that for the time being. I also want to point out that the program is never designed to number a space. It sounds like a nice idea, but these are not reserved. There's no reserved spaces.
Correct.
No reserved spaces. It's just a space where someone can park if they have that permit. That's it. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Alderman Shoneman. Any additional conversation with regard to that, Director Cummings?
So if it's the pleasure of this committee, I could send this legislation in if you'd like. The deadline is upon us, and it would be a first reading on Tuesday night. That would, it may need to be amended to some degree here or there, depending on what you'd want to do, but you pretty much see the finalized version of the material terms in front of you. If that is your desire, I'd need to understand sponsorships, if you were so inclined, to be able to move that forward. I would recommend adding in a sunset provision to revisit this 1 year from enactment. That's something that we had discussed previously that I think would be a good thing, and something that I know internally here in the city we wanted to institute to ensure that this would not interfere with trash collection or public safety or any of the other functions and operations that are taken on by city staff.
Has that committee met yet or been assembled? I know that we were on the phone one day. Have you met since?
Yes, a couple times, and that's where we got to the point where what's represented in front of you is vetted internally, that the city staff has a comfortableness moving forward with. They requested that a 1 year pilot program be instituted to double check that what their assumptions are is actually true.
Okay. Alderman Shoneman.
We're considering getting this drafted up. I have one question. I walk the area, and Terrace Street parallels Auburn Street, just one further south. And if we look, Terrace sort of crosses Charles Street, and it's a dead-end street there, right, goes towards the railroad tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And, yeah, they're right there. So on that side, right, that stretch right there, there's very limited parking there, and the folks that live there had been, rightly or wrongly, legally or illegally, parking in that lot that really belongs to 40 Franklin. Oh, yeah. And now that has been purchased, and there's a fence up there.
Mm-hmm.
And so those folks can't park there anymore, and really, they don't have any place to park. So I wonder, is there any way that we could add something for them on that street, or if not on that street, nearby? What do we do for someone like that? Maybe they weren't parking in 40 Franklin legally, but they were. We have a couple of dead-end streets. So we have like Beacon Court, for instance, a very small street that, not as small as this. This is just a very short dead end. But what can we do? I'd like to know what we can do for them, if
Director
anything.
Cummings.
So we did not look at Terrace Street. I didn't think we did. I just double-checked that. I'm very sympathetic, and I understand the concerns that are being raised. I would not want to recommend at this time us moving forward with doing anything with Terrace Street until we actually looked at it in closer detail, obviously wanting to make sure we take into consideration public safety and DPW type operations. So if it's the pleasure of this committee, over the next week or two, we will make that specific evaluation.
Alderman Shoneman.
That sounds great. That's really all I'm looking for. I don't want to forget about it because they were using that lot.
I do want to, just 2 points of clarification with Terrace
Downtown
Street.
Specialist Vale.
Terrace Street was deemed too narrow, and the component, which was a dead end, it was one of the criteria that DPW asked that we do not include dead-end streets.
Thank you. Alderman Shoneman and then Lopez.
Thanks. We already have elsewhere, but maybe not going forward, maybe no more. But it's some kind of accommodation. Maybe they could park on Charles or something like that.
Alderman Lopez.
So I'm excited that we're making progress, and that I appreciate all the work that the Economic Development Office is doing. Personally, I'd be happy to sponsor it if it goes forward. But I would wonder if we could just order some extra passes so that there is the opportunity to review specific areas and come up with a method that doesn't, isn't poorly thought out and rushed. But at the same time, it leaves us a little bit of ability to address needs. So I'm just basically asking through the chair to City Clerk Pietsu, could we just order extra permits, and then as the committee is able to work out with economic development what a plan would be that would work, then we would just be able to apply extra permits? I mean, I know a number
So-
of blanks are already ordered, I'm sure.
City Clerk Pietsu, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that you do order extras. Some of them may be unnumbered so that you can allocate them as necessary, but would you like to address Alderman Lopez's question specifically?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So Alderman Lopez, yes, we currently order the amount allowed, 400, and then we order 100 blank ones currently. So individuals that have switched cars, or cars have been in an accident, we issue the same number. So yeah, we can look at ordering additional passes, but I don't want to order an amount that I know we will not use. I mean, I can look at ordering 1,000, but I would like for this committee's recommendation as to what they were looking at, an overall number. I have no problem ordering additional passes.
And again, as we look at the Tree Street area, I believe that there are 400 stalls approximately, and to date, we have
360 use.
360 use, okay. So it's 90% of the spaces available have been permits purchased.
Correct.
And you have 10% above and beyond that are available. Okay. Certainly, come on up and,
Okay, that is why I
But-
changed my mind.
just one moment. We need you at a mic, and we need you to state your
Okay,
name and
that
address
is why I
again.
changed my mind on pro
it.
to con.
Name and address, please.
Oh, Burt Kempton, 30 Auburn Street.
Thank you.
That exact reason is why I changed my mind from pro to con, because if you're giving these people the permits, they ain't gonna do us any good up on the hill. You see what I mean? I was one of the ones bugging the mayor every week. We need overnight parking, we need overnight parking. And then the people down over the hill got all thrown out of their parking. And if you give them permits, they're gonna come up over the hill and park, and what good is it gonna do his building? What good is it gonna do us? Now we're not gonna have enough space for the people that have been asking for it. I'm sorry for these people. I understand their point. One guy's been parking there for 25 years. I'm sorry about that, but you can't help this one and hurt that one. That's
you.
why that was the point I made there.
Yes, thank
Thank
you,
you.
sir. Director Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, as everyone can now see, this is a very sensitive and delicate issue that we have been working diligently on since this summer, wanting to balance everyone's concerns, and rightfully so. So with that being said, I would like to go back to the DPW and actually have a very specific question about terrace and see what we might be able to do. I think that will be the best way to resolve the situation. I will make an editorial comment that neighborhoods and communities need to think of some of the public infrastructure as for a community benefit for the whole. And to improve the neighborhood as a whole, rising tides lifts all boats. And though it may not make sense to you in terms of providing a benefit that you might not directly see, it will, in the long run, help improve your neighborhood overall. So, with that being said, Mr. Chairman, I just need some direction as to whether there's a comfort for us to actually submit the legislation that's in front of you, or if you'd like to hold it for another meeting. We do have a Board of Aldermen meeting coming up, I believe, in December. Oh, I'm sorry, the last week in November.
Yeah, I think it's pushing it for us to try to address this before the end of the year if we don't act on it now. So we asked the audience, we had participation this evening. They indicated that they were comfortable with the southern end of Auburn between Charles and Locust on the northern side of Auburn Street. I think we can move forward with that piece.
Okay.
And so we have, so if you would submit that through legal, get it onto next week's Board of Aldermen agenda on the 14th. And then it will be referred back to committee, and it'll come right back here. So if anybody has any issues with the legislation, again, you're more than welcome to join us at our next meeting, which would be on the 22nd, Wednesday, the 22nd. We could have it back on on our agenda, and then we could have it taken care of by our meeting in December.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
You know what? Actually, as I look at the calendar, we could, it would, well, it would be back to the full board by the 28th of November. So if it receives a positive recommendation, we could have this resolved before the end of this month. Okay? Second and fourth Tuesday, yeah. It would be the 28th. Okay. So you're going to send that off to legal and get it on the Board of Aldermen agenda for next week.
Sponsorships?
Anybody would like to sponsor that? You see Alderman Lopez is eager to sponsor that legislation. Any additional sponsors that would like to be put on prior to it going to the full board? Okay. So you've got Alderman Lopez as a sponsor. Excellent, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, one last point. I would like to make sure it's clear
Oh.
that I would be adding in the sunset provision as discussed. That'd be just want to make sure that that's to everyone's wishes.
So the sunset provision is for 1 year.
Of enactment. Yes, sir.
Yes, once it's enacted. Alderman Shoneman.
Thanks. Just for clarification's sake, so we're going to do Auburn, Belmont, Charles, Chestnut, Fairmount, and Franklin, or just Auburn? All those streets that are listed there. We're doing all those, right?
It's all the streets. So it includes Ash, the east side from Central Street to Lake Street. So that's not in this particular area. You've got Auburn Street, you've got Belmont on the south side, you've got Charles Street, the east side from Auburn Street to Fairmont Street. You've got Chestnut, the east side from Kinsley Street to Lake Street. You've got Fairmont, the east side from Amherst Street to Charles Street. And then Franklin Street, the south side from Front Street to Locust. Do you want me to? Here, let me go through them one more time, slowly, and I will only address your neighborhood. So we're fine on Auburn. Everybody's sort of agreed with that. Charles Street. Where's Charles? There it is. Charles Street. We're looking at the east side of the street. So it's on this side. From Auburn Street down to Fairmont. Up. Oh, thank you. We're going this way. All right. That's on the east side of the street. Questions or concerns about that? Okay. Well, we've got one that doesn't want it. There are other people that don't have concerns about it. Who, raise your hand. Who has a concern about that aspect? Okay, 2 people? All right, fine.
Okay, my name is Maureen Noon, and I live on 13 Charles. And the only way that I would be for something like this is if I would be able to purchase a permit and be able to park right in front of my house. I don't want people that I don't know from other areas, from anywhere they can park in front of my house. I don't like that. It's not something that's going to make me feel comfortable when I look outside and I see somebody there I don't know.
All right.
So if I'm able to purchase that permit and I can park in front of my house all the time, that's not a problem. Otherwise, I'm not for it.
I appreciate your comments. I think we've stated earlier that this is, thank you. So we have a person that seconds that as well. In thirding, okay, very good. We are not reserving spots. Spots will be available to anybody, and that's just the way that the parking program has been implemented. So there is no way that we can guarantee you a spot in front of your own property if you were to purchase an overnight parking spot. So that was Charles on the east side. Fairmont, the east side from Amherst to Charles. Fairmont, the east side. Thank you. From Amherst to Charles. Concerns about that area? I see none. All right. And then Franklin. It's the south side of Franklin from Front to Locust. So it's this small area?
No.
Thank you. It's this, there's Front. So it's right in front of 34 Franklin. So it's this span. All right. Questions or concerns about that area? All right. What's the parking up near Bonhoeffer's? Are there stalls up there already? Metered spots? Okay. All right. So, with the exception of Charles Street, we had 3 objections on there. But other than that, I think it addresses the concerns of the neighborhood. And we've modified it so that it meets their needs, with the exception of those 3 objections. And we've included a sunset clause for 1 year from enactment. Now, it's going to be up to your office to put that year in your calendar, because I seriously doubt that somebody from this board is going to say, it's time to review.
Understood.
All right?
Understood.
All right. Yes, ma'am. Please come to the microphone and state your name and address, and
I, thank you. I'm Christine Graham, 30 Auburn Street.
yes, ma'am.
I'm very concerned about Franklin Street. Not that I live there, but once that building 34 on Franklin is occupied, you're going to have a tremendous amount of traffic coming out onto Front Street, which is a very narrow street. I dropped someone off at the Cotton Mill building recently, and you really, coming out of Front Street onto Franklin, you really cannot see oncoming traffic to the left because of the building. And when they first renovated the Cotton Mill building, I thought, and a lot of people thought, that there was going to be access from that building, their parking lot in the back, to connect to the Broad Street Parkway. Because Franklin is already a very narrow, busy street. There's a lot of traffic, both trucks and vehicles through there. You've got directly across from Front Street, you have the credit union. There's traffic coming out of there. There's a big parking lot there now being used. And there are also some apartment buildings on the north side of Franklin. I'm wondering, are there any plans for an access road from the parking lot in back of the mill building on Franklin Street to alleviate traffic onto Franklin Street?
Thank you very much for your question and concern. Director Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer to that question is yes, there is a plan, and yes, there is an ambition, and it is part of the statewide transportation improvement program to connect Franklin Street to the Broad Street Parkway. So it wouldn't be in the rear, as previously discussed. It would actually be in front of that area right there to the Broad Street Parkway. It is financially cost prohibitive at this time to move forward with it. We would need some state assistance to do that. Early projections on that project are approximately $4 million, but it is something that we are looking at doing for the reasons as articulated.
Thank you very much, Director Cummings.
I'd just like to...
Name and address again, please.
Christine Graham, 30 Auburn. I don't know how you could connect Franklin to the Parkway because you have the railroad. Don't you have the right-of-way there in the front of the building? It would have to come from the back because you'd either have to build a bridge over the railroad tracks or tunnel underneath it.
Well,
There's no way.
We would go over the tracks. It wouldn't necessarily be a bridge, but it would be a railroad crossing, grade crossing, and that's the expensive piece of the project.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. All right, you're good with that one. Next discussion point, status update on East Pearl Street meter legislation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And
Again,
for the audience members, thank you very much for joining us this evening. You were very helpful. All right, Director Cummings? Oh, City Clerk Piazzu.
I think at this point, I was here for the overnight. If you have no objections.
I want you to stay.
I appreciate your guidance whenever possible. In the morning, so you should probably go.
All right, so City Clerk Piazzu, I believe that you are free to go.
Thank you.
Director Cummings, if you would provide an update on East Pearl Street meter legislation. And City
Yes.
Clerk Piazzu, I'm just going to excuse myself and walk out with you for a moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As before you, you'll see a memo that outlines that there is some draft legislation for the committee's review, which I'm hopeful that you will be willing to sponsor, and we can submit for the deadline for the next Board of Aldermen meeting. It follows the conversation that we have had previously on this matter, where we're looking to tweak the 2-hour parking and maintain the meter on East Pearl, but remove the meters on Quincy Street. That is essentially the update on this specific piece of legislation. Happy to go into further detail if necessary, and if it's the pleasure of the chair, take any questions.
Questions or comments from committee? Alderman Lopez.
Just a comment. This looks like basically what we asked for the last one, so is it appropriate to just amend the existing ordinance that I put in to replace it with this copy?
Director Cummings?
Whatever the pleasure of the committee is, my understanding was from the previous meeting, there was a comfort level of actually creating separate legislation, which is what we did here. It's actually 2 pieces of legislation, I believe specifically. And the prevailing thought is that the legislation that you just referenced, that you're the sponsor of, would lay on the table until the expiration of the session, and that's what we did.
Alderman Lopez, any additional?
I have-
Alderman Shoneman?
I have a problem with it.
Yep, I think that's what we talked about last time. It sounds like a reasonable plan, because it was complex, and this way it's taken care of. They've gone to the trouble to do it, and legal's gone to the trouble to do it. They've done what we've asked. I think we have 2 new pieces of legislation here, and Alderman Lopez could quite easily sponsor them, hopefully, if he's willing to, and then I think it solves that issue.
Excellent. We didn't want to speak for you, Alderman Lopez. Would you like to sponsor it?
Yeah, I'm happy. I think I might have confused myself. I thought last time we were just saying, write it out, and then we would amend it all using that written language, but I'm just as happy to just sponsor 2 new pieces and
We appreciate
leave
the
the
work
other
that
one alone.
your office has done, Director Cummings. Alderman Lopez is a sponsor.
Thank you.
And we can move forward with that along the same time frame as the original, the first piece that we just discussed.
Thank you.
Does that mean we're moving on to pay by sell?
If it's the pleasure of the chair.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you have a memo in front of you which basically articulates in detail what I'm going to say just very briefly, which is that we submitted sent out a request for proposals looking for pay-by-cell. We were pleased to receive, I believe, six responses from various groups, all very credible entities. We have selected 3 to continue ongoing conversations with, and we had our first group interview. There is a small select team of professional staff working on selecting a vendor. Before we go further on this, we will bring it back to the Infrastructure Committee to have a greater conversation in detail. So there is a comfort level with the Board of Aldermen. But I wanted to just provide you this status update so you knew that we were working on this.
Is there going to be a presentation to infrastructure? And will it be the final vendor that's selected, or will it be the 3 vendors that you're interviewing?
Whatever the
I mean,
pleasure of this
I
committee.
don't want to delay the process, but I'd love to have a presentation.
Happy to have a presentation. I think 3 may be a little ambitious. I would, if the committee is comfortable, I would prefer it to be the recommended before we enter into anything finalized or any agreements or develop the scope in any finer detail. We would have a public presentation on the vendor that we are looking to select.
Would the committee be interested in that presentation?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. Alderman Lopez?
I was just saying. Yeah, I think I'd rather just see what is being recommended than have everybody pitching and then us have to make some kind of comment on not knowing which
Very
one's going
good.
to go
All
forward.
right. So we're in agreement there.
Thank you.
Do you get into the financials of these companies? How strong financially they are?
It came up at length today, yes.
Okay. Because sometimes it's a new technology and they're just fly-by-night and they don't have the capital to
Yes.
maintain their product or service. So the 3 that were selected are financially stable?
Very much so.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? Next discussion point is the status update on the School Street parking lot RFP. No
that-
written update available, oral only.
Yeah, that's funny. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to give you a quick update, although you don't have anything written in front of you. As you may recall, we put out an RFP for the School Street parking lot. I was hoping to actually have a better or more detailed update for you this evening. However, the meeting that we are having with the developer who responded from Florida is coming up from Florida. We're meeting with them tomorrow to start that conversation. And what I'm hoping for or anticipating and would like is to call to your attention the fact that I would be looking to have a non-public session in the near future to actually go into more specifics about the real estate transaction. And I wanted to make sure that the committee was well aware of the efforts that we were making thus far.
Is the 22nd too soon for that conversation?
Nope.
Is anybody going to be away on Wednesday, the 22nd? Maybe an early holiday?
I don't go anywhere.
Tom will be here. All right. I'd love to be able to do it. I'll confirm that we'll have a quorum that evening. All right?
Great.
Excellent. Thank you. And those were your discussion points this evening, is that correct?
Well, Mr. Chairman, if you continue on, you'll see general discussion at the end of the agenda relative to a couple other items that I want to make this committee aware of.
Do we have a motion to go out of order to address the general discussion topics at the end of the at the end of the agenda for Director Cummings to speak to now?
I'll make the motion.
Motion by Alderman McGinnis is to go out of order to bring up the general discussion topics. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. And we are going out of order. Director Cummings, if you'd like to continue with those 3 topics, Park and Ride, Crown Street parking lot, Elm Street parking lot, review and scope of services for Main Street discussion, making the area more pedestrian friendly. You may once again have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there's a memo in your packet, if you'll see in what it, there's a memo in your packet which outlines an ambition that I wanted to call before this committee, which is developing rules and regulations for park and ride facilities. I wanted to make a recommendation that the city consider developing or standardizing some policies and regulations that govern this type of asset. As you may or may not know, the city is getting ready to activate our new park and ride on Crown Street. We already have one park and ride over by Conway Arena. It was brought to my attention that we don't necessarily have anything specific at hand in terms of management, and I'm not exactly sure what the pleasure of this committee would be. So all this memo really is calling your attention to this issue and eventually looking to ask for some guidance. For instance, would we want to prohibit trailers from parking in the park and ride type facilities? That's something that I would want to get guidance on from you. What's an appropriate time period for vehicles if they were to stay? Should we have overnight parking? We have already on our own started doing some due diligence and started looking at best practices that other park and ride facilities have throughout not just New Hampshire, but in the New England area. I would be using those to guide any recommendation that I made to you. But before I got too far, I wanted to just start the conversation.
Thank you, Director Cummings. When is the park and ride on Crown Street coming online?
This winter, December.
December, okay. And you'd like to have, so within the next 15 to 21 days?
I think that may be a little ambitious, Mr. Chairman, but I think if we were to do something over the winter and into the spring, in the next few months, I think it would be appropriate. I mean, it's fair to say that we've gone thus far without actually having anything articulated for our current park and ride facility. We've treated it as though we've treated other parking lots that we manage. So we could continue to do that if that's the ambition of this committee. But being that a parking ride is different than a traditional surface parking lot, I wanted to just bring this to your attention.
Thank you. Alderman Shoneman.
Thanks. I think it's a good idea. We should see about having a standard policy, and if it's something that the new board wants to consider when that comes up, then they can do it, but I would say that it sounds like a good idea.
Do you want to start the guidance now? Do you want to spend committee time working on at least a precursor for the new board to consider?
That sounds like it's kind of tough. It sounds like you want to draft something first to bring in, right?
Well, if I just really wanted to start the conversation, Mr. Chairman, if I may. What I was looking to do is I would have, the skeleton of a policy or a plan to present to you, and then have an iterative process with this committee. We could do it in the December timeframe if you'd like. I would not anticipate legislation until January.
I'm happy to have it be part of this committee's work prior to the end of the term, understanding that we're going to have a new board come January. So anything that we do might be altered.
Understood.
All right, very good. Next general topic is it Mulberry parking lease? Elm Street parking.
Elm, or as I've been corrected, Maple Street parking lot specifically, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. And really what I wanted to do in this communication was make you aware of a very interesting prospect that we have going on right now. Before I start, I want to make sure it's clear that no material terms have been negotiated or discussed in any detail, but what we have started is an engagement with a local developer here in Nashua, lives in Nashua, who has reached out to us and expressed a desire or an ambition to redevelop 11-13 Mulberry Street into somewhere between 25 and 30 market rate apartments. As you may or may not know, The building right now is 100% unoccupied. It's currently used for warehouse and storage. And at one time, the building was used as a commercial bakery. I've provided a parcel map because I believe it's important to illustrate the very specific details relative to this project and this development, because there are some challenges.
All right, you have more details?
So I outlined the very specific requests that the developer has brought to us, which is one, the developer, as the map and parcel will articulate or show, is it's just the building itself. And so whether it's this developer or any developer that we work with in the future, parking to make the site actually productive is going to be a conversation to be had. And so I'm very comfortable with, and I would like to continue in this conversation, and that's to enter into a lease agreement, which we have done from time to time with this specific developer, and help him attract financing to be able to do the project. So what do I mean by that? A long-term lease is going to be necessary. He has asked for 50 years. I would not recommend that to this body, but that is his initial ask. I have provided him with a copy of the commercial parking lease that we used for the Pine Street Extension parking lot that services the mill yard, and specifically Steve Bonnett's property. He is looking for approximately 40 spaces. How we draw that line is still to be determined, and we are working through that. We, as a city, need to preserve 20-ish spaces to accommodate the public health building, and also for other arrangements that we already have with lease agreements for single spots.
How many stalls are in this property?
That's a good question, Mr. Chairman. I want to say 70?
76.
76.
76 stalls, you need 20 for public health, and they want 40. So you've got 16 additional stalls in there. And how are those 16 stalls, how do we monitor those?
They're currently not used, obligated. Mr. Veo may be able to speak in more detail.
Mr. Vale?
And believe it or not, the Maple Street lot is partially metered as Zone 3, and so the remaining spaces could just remain Zone 3 metered spaces.
So how many of the 76 stalls are metered?
I'd say approximately 60% of them.
It's
Is
all
it
the
this
stuff
back
that-
row?
Yeah,
yes,
it's the back row.
Yeah. So more like 40%. So I would note that just in my ancillary conversation with Jill Stansfield, the parking manager, that they have very low revenue.
Again, Mr. Chairman, it's my understanding that these spots aren't really utilized, and that there is ample ability to program them.
Alderman Lopez?
So they probably don't have revenue during the day, but has their utilization been checked at night? Particularly, my thinking is there's a number of restaurants, bars, clubs on that scene, and I think people park there in the evening that may not be generating revenue during the day, but may also be competing with residents of this new building at night. So I just want to make sure that somebody is checking to make sure we know how many of them are being used before that starts happening.
Well, you say it's Zone 3, right? So what time does parking end in Zone 3?
6 p.m. I don't, it's a good question.
All right.
6
Second question is,
6 p.m., right?
second question is, in Zone 3, isn't it free parking on weekends?
Yes, and I believe it's 6 p.m.
Okay. So I'm not sure there would be any or very little income in the evening as well. Alderman Lopez?
Just to clarify my point, I wasn't concerned about the income. I was saying the income may not reflect the evening usage. Some of those clubs, bars, et cetera, are open pretty late, and so people are parked there pretty late. So
I
at
misun-
like 2 a.m., you might have people trying to park or move or whatever
I
around people who
misunderstood.
live.
So they're being utilized, but they're still not necessarily generating any parking revenue from the metered stalls. Director Cummings.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a point well taken. We would anticipate having to direct or steer people to the Elm Street garage to be able to accommodate for this. And so that's just something that would be culturally have to come about over time and accepted, because it would be, the idea would be to provide private exclusive use of 40-ish spaces for the redevelopment of this building, which isn't uncommon. We have done that in other areas of the city. The difference is now is the specific developer is looking for a long-term lease type commitment to be able to go to a bank to finance the deal.
Alderman Lopez.
It might be challenging, in my opinion, only because people are probably pretty intoxicated walking to and from. I don't know that, I would be concerned about encouraging that many people to cross West Hollis in the evening while other people are getting into or leaving bars, because the reality is no one should be driving drunk. Everyone should be behaving responsibly. People shouldn't be wandering out into the road, but that's a pretty heavily trafficked intersection space, like that area between Elm and Main Street. So I'm not expressing any opinion over what you should do. I'm just saying you'd want to consider that too.
I mean,
Director Cummings.
so there's another major element to this that I also want to make sure I make explicit to the infrastructure committee, though. Technically, this element would go before the entire board of aldermen, unlike the first element, which is very infrastructure specific. That's the developer has approached us to ask us to enter into what we refer to as a 79E, which the city has done in the past. It's essentially a tax incentive program. I took the liberty to essentially sketch out what the developer has asked of us, and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet.
Oh, yeah.
Just to help give us order of magnitude of what's being looked at for a developer to help make this project pencil. I will note again for the record, nothing has been agreed to as of yet. I just wanted to make this committee aware that a tax type of incentive is going to be necessary to make the project pencil. I would be willing to recommend an incentive if it was appropriately crafted. And I wanted to just start that dialogue with you all tonight to make sure that you are aware of this conversation.
Mr. Veo, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just going back to the Maple Street lot, one other element to take into account is business ends at 5 o'clock for the health department. So they do have sometimes meetings in the evening, which they would need incidental use of this during weekdays. But essentially, all those spaces become available at night for use by the public. So
Is it fair to question what the redevelopment would be? What are they planning on doing with this 1113 Mulberry?
Mr. Chairman, not only do I think it's a fair question, I think it's wholly appropriate. If you are essentially by default becoming a financial partner in this, I think you'd want to ensure that you're getting the type of product that you'd be looking for. And I've actually on my own already discussed this with the developer, thinking out loud that I would want to make sure that the city got what it was looking for in terms of a product it could be proud of. The developer has to date represented to us that he is more than willing and happy to have that conversation and to memorialize it as necessary, so there's a comfort level. His plan right now is to make it market rate, hardwood floor, stainless steel, a market quality that would be what one would expect to attract the type of caliber of tenant that I would be looking for to help revitalize this neighborhood, and that would be competitive with the other apartments that are coming into the marketplace, namely the apartments over off of Bridge Street, and then further up the road off of Factory with the Brady Sullivan project.
Questions, comments? Alderman Shoneman.
Again, I think this is a great idea. I think that doing market rate housing development in this part of town is good. It sounds like the parking space issue would work. If 50 years is not the right time, then whatever time frame, we can negotiate with them would be great. 40 spaces seems like it's a number that's workable for us. We have surplus after the 40 and after the public health building, and then some of that public health space would revert to public use in the evening. And redeveloping that area. It's very close to Main Street and getting people out and about, walking around. I think we've talked about a critical mass of people on the streets, and for that to happen, they need to be living down there. We want people down there and market rate housing, and it all sounds good. I think that the committee should do what it can to endorse the advancement of this. I would further recommend that the idea of a tax incentive is fine with me. Again, we've had, how long has that building been sitting there? A long time. And if we need to do something to incentivize someone to come in there, fully in support of that as well. It's an incentive that has an expiration. Essentially, it would go in this example here to 2030, and that's not really that far away. And then it would revert to regular tax rate, right?
That's correct. That's absolutely.
So I think getting that kind of development is exactly the kind of thing that we need in Nashua. It'll go a long ways to make, or has the potential. And if we want to see a plan at some point, I'd sure like to see it. I think it sounds great overall.
Wonderful. Anecdotally, I will just tell you that I met a young lady last night that moved here from San Diego. And she indicated that her market rate apartment was much more expensive than anything she ever had in San Diego, which I find quite interesting. So take it for what it's worth. I'm not sure market rate is, necessarily something that's affordable for people that are trying to come into the community, but it is what it is. It's market rate. And very good. All right, any additional questions or comments? All right, thank you. You have one more topic, is that correct?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Though before we jump off of this current one, and I know the
Yes.
hour is getting late, and I apologize. I just want to make sure everyone understands the Excel spreadsheet that I provided. I didn't go into any detail on it, and I don't want to waste the committee's time. But there are some big numbers in here. I just want to make sure it's clear that this is for discussion purposes only. This is essentially a mock-up of what the developer has asked for. I would never recommend something like this to the committee, but I do want to start the dialogue with you to let you know that I would recommend something to be able to make this project pencil, something to make the debt service on the pro forma a little bit more attractive, so a bank would be looking to underwrite this.
So what's the minimum number of years that a bank would be willing to underwrite something like this?
That's a great question, Mr. Chairman. I can't answer that specifically. I can tell you that most of the past deals I've been involved with where I've done something like this, typically banks want to make sure that the product stabilizes, cash flows appropriately. The length isn't necessarily, in my humble and unsolicited opinion, for the bank. It's more for the developer when they want to flip it to another buyer, that they can show that their NOI looks a little bit better. So I'm always very sensitive to longer type tax incentives. I don't necessarily recommend them. In this particular program, it's a minimum of 5 years at a maximum of 13 years. I think I think I'm safe to say that we've currently done a deal like this, and we did it at 5 years. and that was for Cotton Mill. I think that's good precedent for us to jump off of. Every deal is different, so will we need to be a little open-mindedness to go one way or the other on this? I would say yes, but those are conversations still to be had, and I guess that's all I can say at this point.
All right, very good. What's the expectation? When does this sort of become more solid and we'll have something to react to and provide more guidance for you?
So that's a great question, Mr. Chairman. So part of that is this conversation this evening. The developer is very aggressive and wanting to get something locked up. I would like to, the lease is pretty standard. All the terms that would be in the lease for the parking lot are terms that this committee has seen in the past. So I think I would be able to represent to the developer a comfort level that this committee would be willing to do something in the range of, 20 to 50 years. I haven't gotten very specific with him yet, but I'd like to keep it to the lower end of 20. The income that would come off of it, because we wouldn't be doing this for free, he has asked for basically to rent the parking spaces at what we currently take in for income and then increase it by 2% every 5 years for that to be revisited in increments of 5 years. So we're always being competitive with the market. I'm not prepared to recommend that to this committee. I articulated to him that we would be looking to do something a little bit more what we do for every other parking lot, which would be essentially $50 a month for each space. That may be a little too aggressive, so we might need to discount it for a time being, particularly at the beginning years. And that's why I believe the Pine Street Extension commercial parking lot lease is a good example of past precedent that we have as to how we've handled that. We do not treat that parking lot the same as we do other parking lots. That per space is around $10 to $15. So that is heavily discounted. I think we would be doing something a little bit more aggressive than that, but it wouldn't be at the $50 rate. So all those conversations would still be still to be had. I would want to work through those details over the next couple of weeks and ultimately try to present something to you by the last meeting in November.
Very good. Why don't you share with us those two examples of the leases? And then of the parking lot leases, the Pine Street extension and the other one that you were talking about, so that we can react to that. And then the Stabile property where you said that there was a 5-year, let's take a look at that as well.
Okay.
And I'm just curious, is our developer watching this meeting?
I don't know.
He's a Nashua developer, and he could be watching us, and we could be discussing everything that he's going to, provide counterpoint to. So I'm not certain that we should be having this conversation in public.
That's a point well taken, Mr. Chairman. That's why I've been very broad in some of my comments.
Very good. So why don't you reach out to legal, ask them if we need to go into a non-public to have the detailed conversation that we should be having. All right? All right. Yes, ma'am.
Could I come up with a comment that I was going to make a long time ago, but I don't have the agenda, so I wasn't sure if you were finished with that. With your board.
Why don't you come up, introduce yourself, and nope, that's fine.
I just want to interrupt you, so I was just waiting. My name's Lauren Buchanan, and I'm here to represent the people on Belmont Street. And we were talking about overnight parking. Then you went on to from the Auburn Street, and you started talking about East Pearl or something.
Correct.
And I was sort of under the impression that we would then go talk about Belmont or whatever. And I just wanted to be, just to say that we've been asking the people who live on Belmont to attend the meetings or email, or attend the meetings, email. They're just hoping to get overnight parking. There's no businesses across the street really that would oppose it. And I was just hoping to be able to tell them that, yes, it looks like it will probably go through, and it will know shortly, because then they won't have to keep wondering and asking me if anything's happened.
Well, I appreciate you asking the question, and I apologize that you sat here this long. What we've done is we've taken the ordinance, and it's going back to legal. It'll be introduced at next Tuesday's Board of Aldermen meeting for a first reading. It'll be assigned to committee. Belmont Street, the legislation is drafted to have Belmont Street with parking on the south side of Belmont. And that will come, like I said, to the Board of Aldermen next week. It will be sent back to this committee the week after, so the following Wednesday, which is, I believe, the 22nd of November. It should be back in this committee. And then if you have anybody on Belmont Street that would like to come that evening to speak with regard to it, they are more than welcome to join us.
Is there a chance, when would we possibly know that this might go into, that might be approved, and so they can at least know that that might happen down the road here?
So as we discussed, if it comes before our committee on the 22nd, it would go back before the full board on the 28th of November. And then at that point, it would just be up to City Clerk Patricia Piazzu to implement that process, make sure that we've got all the stalls painted in the particular areas. And once that's done, then you'd be able to purchase your tickets and park on the particular street that you're interested in.
Okay, thank you. I just love to be able to tell them, yes, it's going to go through. We'll have to wait for it to happen, but.
Yeah, it most likely before the end of the year, weather permitting. And then if not, it'll be implemented in the springtime once the snow leaves the ground. All right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank
very
you so much.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Every second and fourth, or first and third Wednesday, right?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that, Director Cummings. So you were going to follow up with legal, determine if we need to go into non-public to discuss the specifics of what we would recommend so that we don't necessarily play our cards in public. Okay, very good. Was there anything else that we needed to discuss? So we're going to
One other.
Main Street? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there's a memo before you, taking the comments that were made by the Infrastructure Committee at the last meeting. The Office of Economic Development reached out to a consultant to find out for, cost and scope, and essentially what we outlined was, and I wanted to make sure that this was tracking, and the thought process of the committee was that a study area between Main Street, basically the bridge, to East or West Hollis Street, essentially one block on either side of Main Street, to what would be an initial meeting with staff to discuss preliminary concepts, techniques, strategies that will calm Main Street, make it more pedestrian friendly. That will then be taken into consideration. It will be viewed through a lens of the operational analysis that has been conducted in the past relative to our circulation and performance of traffic. Some draft sketches will be made up. A presentation by the consultant to the Infrastructure Committee with input from the committee and feedback coming, and then ultimately the plans, and I say plans, I use that term loosely. It's really just a concept sketch to use for helping us to develop engineered plans later on would be the deliverable. That is actually coupled with another very similar exercise that actually the mayor's office asked our office to undertake relative to comments that came from Clock Tower Place relative to the area of Factory and Walnut Street. So wanting to be as efficient as possible, we wanted to tie the two together To do all this, we received a quote of approximately $4,000. My recommendation would be is that there is some leftover money in an escrow account that was under the charge of economic development. We would want to repurpose that money for this very specific cause. To do that, legislation would be required. I'd be happy to tee up that legislation in the fall if it was ultimately passed by the beginning of January. We would then be able to enter into a contract and execute on this type of program for right after the first of the year.
Questions or comments? Alderman Lopez?
Without throwing a monkey wrench into the plan you have, is it possible to also look at the Main Street sidewalks from Lake Street to West Hollis? It's my impression from that area that a lot of the issues with traffic approaching or leaving the intersection of West Hollis and Main Street also has to combat people who are crossing in unusual fashions across Main Street within those blocks. And I think that's happening because the sidewalks are kind of unpredictable. They're not as maintained, they're not as regular. In some places, they don't really even exist.
Could I ask the chairman to show me Lake and Main? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, just by watching that exercise, unfortunately, I would have to recommend against including that at this time. That's a whole separate project. I will note that Mr. Veo just made a comment to me that if he wants to elaborate on it, I believe he has some confidence that he might be able to do something internally. But if it's the pleasure of this committee, after we get done with Main Street at the other end, we'd be happy to look at this.
Alderman Lopez?
In making my request, I was aware that doubling the length of it might not go over so well. I just wanted to put it out there and see what the possibilities were. So I would appreciate any attention that could be put in that area.
Mr. Veo?
I'm happy to work with Alderman Lopez to identify a scope of work for study here, very similar to what happened in the area of Factory and Walnut, which I believe Tim will speak to next. Director Cummings will speak to next. And Alderman Lopez has been a witness to the exercise for the area of Factory and Walnut, so he can speak to the level of confidence and my assistance there.
Thank you. Any other discussion?
I'm confident in Director Veo's
I'm downtown specialist, not
downtown
director.
specialist James Veo's approach.
All right, so it's $4,000 for a sketch and some initial meetings, infrastructure committee, finalized plans. And then we received the sketch in January, so that'd be under the auspices of the next board as well. Director Cummings.
Again, to execute on that program that you just outlined, legislation would be necessary. A transfer would need to occur. And I would need direction as to whether I should be teeing up and submitting that type of legislation, and if so, sponsorship for that. And I'd be happy to try to get that
I'd make the
done.
request of Mayor Donchis.
Okay.
Yeah. Ask him if he wants you to do this. It's fine with us, and then he can be the sponsor. Director Cummings?
Thank you. I was only bringing that up specifically because I noted that it was Alderman Schoeneman who had actually brought this to our attention. So.
Alderman Schoeneman?
Thanks. Again, I'm glad we're taking a look at it. I think it's great. I'd be happy to sponsor it, but, at the end of the term, sponsorship from Mayor Donchis would probably be appropriate.
I'd
be happy with that, and I'll certainly support it, because if we could do something to begin moving in that direction, well, along with all the other things we've been talking about this evening.
Exactly.
I think it's a great program.
Good.
Thanks.
All right. So we're done with the topics. We've gone out of order. Are we ready to go back to the regular order of business? Because Mr. Cody has been patiently sitting in the back.
Yes.
So we need to get to his piece of legislation. Okay, so the motion will be to go back to the regular order of business. Discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. All right, regular order business, communications. I will make a motion that the rules be so far suspended as to allow for the introduction of communications received after the agenda was prepared. Do I need to speak to those communications, or do you want to just, well, I will say discussion. All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Very good. The communications are, and I apologize, Mr. Clerk, I'm just going to run through them really
No, that's
quickly if you
fine,
don't
yeah, I
mind.
was gonna ask.
From Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development, regarding overnight parking discussion cover memo. From Director Cummings, Director of Economic Development, relative to the rescinding of a parking meter on the north side of East Pearl Street between Quincy and Holmes. From James Veo, Downtown Specialist, Economic Development Division, follow-up on pay-by-cell services for metered parking in downtown Nashua. From Director Cummings, Director of Economic Development, Resolution 1734 status update. From Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development, regarding park and ride rules and rules or regulations. From James Veo, Downtown Specialist, Economic Development Division, development incentive for 11-13 Mulberry and parking lease for Maple Street lot. And finally, a memo from Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development, traffic calming concepts for Main Street and review of Walnut Factory connections. Is there a motion to accept and place those on file? Alderman McGinnis is making the motion to accept and place on file. Discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. That motion carries. Unfinished business, there is none. New business, there is none. Tabled in committee, we have Resolution 17-134, authorizing the sale of land on the east side of Medical Center Drive, Sheet 13, Lot 12, to Southern New Hampshire Medical Center for $300,000, establishing an expendable trust fund for downtown redevelopment initiatives, and appropriating the $300,000 of proceeds into the expendable trust fund. Is there a motion to take this from the table? Alderman Shoneman.
Our 17-134 from the table.
The motion by Alderman Shoneman is to take Resolution 17-134 from the table. Discussion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. And Resolution 17-134 is taken from the table. Is there a motion, a further motion? Alderman Shoneman.
I'd like to hear Director Cummings speak on it, but I like what I'm reading here, and so when we hear the conversation, then we'll make a motion.
So would you like to make a motion for final passage?
I'll make a motion to recommend final passage.
So we can
for
begin discussion.
Yes.
Okay, the motion by Alderman Shoneman is to recommend final passage of Resolution 17-134. Director Cummings and Mr. Cody, are you joining us for the conversation? You just? Okay, very good. Director Cummings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a memo in your packet, which hopefully you've had a chance to quickly look at this evening. I'm calling your attention to it because there's very specific language that, if is amendable to the committee, I believe will help move this vehicle forward. So essentially, not to go into any great detail, a quick status update. This legislation was before you. It was essentially tabled with an amendment to change the expendable trust fund from being the agent of the mayor to the Board of Aldermen. Pending, there was also a separate item where you were looking to get direction from the Budget Review Committee. The Budget Review Committee passed this favorably, though it was not unanimous. There was some concerns, there was and thoughts that maybe it would be best if the expendable trust fund was treated a little bit differently. In a subsequent conversation post that meeting, it became more clear to me what the concerns were. I was able to work through some of those issues, and if it's okay by the chair, in my memo, I specifically request that in the second paragraph in line 3, after the word include, please strike the following, but is not limited to, and furthermore, by striking the following beautification projects and elimination of blight in line 4 after the word property, and inserting in its place the following: for the purpose of creating additional parking and for the upkeep and maintenance operations of our current parking lots. What this basically will do, it will make the expendable trust fund more specific and more narrowly defined to just maintain or increase our current parking operations, which the administration has no issues with, and we would be happy to see that amendment move forward. And I am asking for your favorable passage of this as amended.
So it went before budget, is that correct? Did they make these amendments in budget?
No.
No, they did not. All right, Alderman Shoneman.
Thank you. I'm on the Budget Committee, and I was the one who raised this issue, and I like the wording. I think that we want to make sure that this language is specific. I didn't like the idea of setting up an expendable trust fund, appropriating money into it with 10 votes without it being more specific, and then just letting that fall to a simple majority in the Board of Aldermen. Mr. Cummings' memo, under the paragraph marked request, you can see he outlines exactly what he just said, and it's okay with me. I'd be happy to make a motion to amend.
Please do, Alderman Shoneman.
I'd like to make a motion to amend. I'm just going to read it right here. In the second paragraph in line 3, after the word include, to strike the following, but is limited to, and furthermore, by striking the following, beautification projects and elimination of blight in line 4, after the word property, and inserting in its place the following, for the purpose of creating additional parking and for the upkeep and maintenance operations of our current parking lots. So that paragraph would read, let's see, make sure I'm in the right one. Further resolved by the Board of Aldermen of the City of Nashua that pursuant to NHRSA 31:19A, the City of Nashua hereby establishes an expendable trust fund for the purpose of downtown redevelopment initiatives, which can include the purchase of real property for the purpose of creating additional parking and for the upkeep and maintenance operations of our current parking lots. We continue. The Board of Aldermen is appointed as the agent to expend. It's not in this online version yet. Any balance remaining in this expendable trust fund in each fiscal year and will not lapse or be closed out to the general fund, but will remain in this expendable trust fund. The idea is that we would sell a parking lot. It's a sale that we're not initiating. The user of the parking lot, Southern Hampshire Medical Center, has approached us. But when we give up real estate like that, it's nice if we can regain some of the same, especially in a city like Nashua where we have such parking issues. So if we can specify in this legislation that we're essentially selling parking, putting money into expendable trust fund that is for the stated purpose of buying and rehabilitating or maintaining parking, I'm happy with it.
Okay.
And I would support it.
Alderman McGinnis.
Yes, I also support that. I was one of the dissenters
Yes,
at
that's
the budget
correct.
meeting. And I'm very happy with the language that you have there. Excuse
Good.
me.
Any additional comments, Alderman McGinnis?
No, sir.
Okay, all right.
Sorry.
So Director Cummings had shared with me, we had a conversation, I can't remember when it was, just recently. And I posed the question because earlier this evening, we were talking about the parking over on Mulberry Street. And the developer wants, some spots and they have a value. And it just, I was trying to draw a correlation between the two scenarios. One lot we're interested in selling for X amount of dollars, and the other lot we're interested in keeping and maintaining a lease so that the city will continue to generate revenue. So I'm trying to internalize and figure out what the difference is between the two properties and why they're being handled in different scenarios, and why we wouldn't want to continue to have a lease over at Southern New Hampshire Medical. Director Cummings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I did not make this explicit in my comments earlier, but if you recall at the previous Infrastructure Committee meeting, I promised you I would bring the memo that was provided to the planning board because I was surprised to hear that you had not seen that. So in your packet, you have actually the memo that was presented to the planning board that actually articulates the analysis, which after internal consideration and evaluation and based on the following, the parking lot is in fair condition and will need approximately $50,000 to $100,000 worth of capital investment over the next few years. Looking at the site and the land clearly was used in conjunction with 21 East Hollis Street, and due to the building's encroachment and disjointed nature of the parcel, it would be difficult to develop ever in the future. The current leaseholder uses 100% of the parking spaces and wants to purchase the parking lot, and there is no obligation for them to currently lease them in the further. And due to the fact that the land and parking lot is in the area where the city has little or to no public demand for the parking other than what is generated by the current user, I felt comfortable making the recommendation that we sell the parking lot. I think much to Mr. Cody's dismay, my comfort level was only in that if we were able to buy another parking lot somewhere else. So we would essentially be redeploying our capital in a way that would benefit us. And that's why the expendable trust fund was very important to me and how this conversation actually evolved. So all we would be doing is essentially realigning our assets, taking it from one area and then trying to use it in a different area for our benefit.
Very good. Thank you, Director Cummings. Alderman Lopez.
I'm pretty supportive of this idea and the other one because both of those lots are underutilized if incorrectly deployed. I guess I kind of like the phraseology there. The one that we're talking about right now is really surrounded by Southern New Hampshire Medical Center, so they're most likely to use it. The city doesn't necessarily need to maintain or upkeep it or invest in it. Whereas the one over by Maple Street, it would encourage a developer to develop, but it also has other areas that are in need of use. So this gives us the opportunity for the developer to develop his building, lease it from the city for some time, and it may be at some point in the future we decide, why are we maintaining the parking lot that he's using most of the time? But for now, we still need it for the public health department. We still have some other uses, and it doesn't make sense to take that step right now. But it would, over on the Maple Street lot, encourage development to enter into that kind of agreement. So I think both of them share the philosophy of what spaces do we have available in downtown that can be utilized better. And I think a lot of good ideas are being presented tonight that have that similarity.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. Any additional comments with regard to Resolution 17134? The motion on the table by Alderman Shoneman is to amend Resolution 17134. Do I need to read the amendment?
No.
Okay. It's spelled out on the memo from Director Cummings. So the motion by Alderman Shoneman is to amend. Additional discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. And that motion to amend has been accepted. So now we have Resolution 17134 as amended. Is there a motion? Alderman Shoneman.
Make a motion to recommend final passage of R 17134 as amended.
Final passage final passage as amended by Alderman Shoneman of Resolution 17134. Any additional discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Very good. That has been final passage as amended. That will be on next week's Board of Aldermen. Any additional things that need to come off the table this evening? So we've got allowing permitted overnight on-street parking on a portion of Ash Street. We're just going to let that die in committee?
Well, it looks like we're.
Alderman Lopez?
It looks like that was integrated into the
That's correct.
plan. Yeah.
So we'll just let it die in committee. Motion, authorizing stop signs on North 7th Street at its intersection with Grand Avenue. Alderman Lopez.
In cooperation with DPW, they found alternate steps because they were not particularly excited about continuing a precedent of a four-way stop as a traffic calming device. So what they did was they painted the intersection to be more obviously a intersection. They also painted a section that was uncurbed, but like it kind of made it ambiguous as to what was road and what was sidewalk, so that it was a more defined intersection. And they'll be installing slow for children, 20 miles recommended signage along the street. I would like to leave that on the table just in case the residents inform me that it's not pulling it off. But yesterday was election day, and there was a lot of traffic at the Boys and Girls Club because the schools were closed, and there weren't complaints from the residents. So it
Good.
looks like it's working.
Excellent. That's good to hear. So we'll leave it on the table. Rescinding the authorization for parking meters on the north side of East Pearl Street between Quincy Street and Holmes Street. Let that die in committee as well? All right, very good. We've already done general discussion. Any additional public comment? All of our public has left this evening. Remarks by Alderman? Alderman Lopez?
I just want to extend appreciation to all of my fellow aldermen who have served their terms and ran for reelection, gave their best pitch to the public, and I appreciate all of the guidance that I've gotten, being a first-time alderman, not really knowing all of the procedures, policies, and practices, and just express my appreciation for that.
You're most welcome, Alderman Lopez. It was our honor. Any additional remarks by Alderman? No need to go into non-public this evening, but maybe next time, Director Cummings?
Yes, sir.
Is there a motion? Alderman Shoneman.
Move to adjourn.
The motion by Alderman Shoneman is to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. We are adjourned at 9:10 PM.